The sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the alien planet Zorath, casting long shadows over the sprawling junkyard that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was thick with the scent of rust and ozone, and the faint hum of distant machinery echoed through the valley. This was the Graveyard of Stars, a place where broken ships, discarded technology, and forgotten dreams came to rest. It was also home to Kael Draven, a human mechanic with a knack for fixing the unfixable. Kael wiped the grease from his hands onto his already stained overalls and squinted at the horizon. He was a wiry man in his late 30s, with a mop of unruly brown hair and a face that had seen too many sleepless nights. His eyes, however, were sharp and calculating, always scanning for the next challenge. Life on Zorath was hard, but Kael had carved out a niche for himself as the best mechanic in the graveyard. If it had bolts, gears, or circuits, Kael could make it work again. But today, Kael wasn't thinking about ships or machines. His mind was on the rumors that had been circulating through the junkyard for weeks. Whispers of an alien dragon that had taken up residence in the northern sector. No one had seen it up close, but the stories were enough to keep even the most daring scavengers away. The dragon was said to be massive, with scales that shimmered like molten metal and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. It was also said to be in pain, its roars echoing through the valley like the cries of a wounded beast. Kael wasn't one to believe in fairy tales, but something about the dragon's cries tugged at him. He had always been drawn to broken things, to the idea that even the most fearsome creatures could be tamed with a little care and understanding. And so, against his better judgment, Kael found himself packing his tools and heading north. The journey was treacherous, the terrain littered with jagged metal and unstable ground. Kael's boots crunched against the debris as he made his way deeper into the northern sector. The air grew colder, and the hum of machinery faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Kael's heart pounded in his chest, but he pressed on, driven by a curiosity he couldn't quite explain. Finally, he reached the edge of a massive crater, its sides steep and lined with twisted metal. At the bottom lay the dragon. Kael's breath caught in his throat. The creature was even more magnificent than the stories had described. Its body was covered in scales that shifted colors in the dim light, from deep crimson to shimmering gold. Its wings were folded against its sides, and its massive head rested on the ground, its eyes closed. But what struck Kael the most was the dragon's foot. One of its massive claws was swollen and discolored, clearly infected. Kael's mind raced. He had come here out of curiosity, but now he was faced with a choice. He could turn back, leave the dragon to its fate, or he could do something no one else had dared to do. He could try to help it. As Kael stood there, the dragon's eyes flicked open, locking onto him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Kael reached into his bag and pulled out his wrench. The dragon's eyes narrowed, but it didn't attack. Kael took that as a sign and began to make his way down into the crater, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he was doing, but he knew one thing for certain. This was going to be the most dangerous repair job of his life. Kael's boots slipped on the loose debris as he descended into the crater, his eyes never leaving the dragon. The creature watched him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, its massive chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Kael could see the infection more clearly now. The dragon's claw was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin around it red and inflamed. It was clear that the creature was in immense pain. "Easy now," Kael muttered, more to himself than to the dragon. "I'm not here to hurt you." The dragon let out a low growl, but it didn't move. Kael took that as a good sign and continued his approach, his wrench clutched tightly in his hand. He had no idea if the tool would be of any use, but it was the only thing he had that might help. As he got closer, Kael noticed something else. The dragon's scales were covered in strange, glowing runes that pulsed faintly in the dim light. He had never seen anything like it before, and it made him wonder just what kind of creature he was dealing with. Was it a beast or something more? Kael pushed the thought aside and focused on the task at hand. He knelt beside the dragon's injured foot, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to examine the claw. The dragon tensed, its muscles coiling like springs, but it didn't pull away. "This is going to hurt," Kael warned, though he wasn't sure if the dragon could understand him. "But I need to get that claw out before the infection spreads." The dragon let out a low rumble, its eyes narrowing as it watched Kael. For a moment, Kael thought it might attack, but then the creature lowered its head, as if giving him permission to proceed. Kael took a deep breath and positioned the wrench around the base of the ingrown claw. He hesitated for a moment, then tightened his grip and pulled with all his strength. The dragon let out a deafening roar, its body thrashing as Kael worked to free the claw. Kael gritted his teeth and held on, his muscles straining as he fought to keep the wrench in place. The claw was lodged deep, and it took every ounce of strength he had to pry it loose. Finally, with a sickening pop, the claw came free. Kael stumbled back, clutching the wrench as the dragon let out another roar, this one more of relief than pain. The creature's body relaxed, and it let out a long, shuddering breath. Kael wiped the sweat from his brow and looked down at the claw in his hand. It was massive, easily the size of his forearm, and covered in dried blood and pus. He tossed it aside and turned his attention back to the dragon, which was now watching him with what he could only describe as gratitude. But before Kael could say anything, the ground beneath him began to tremble. He looked up just in time to see a group of figures emerging from the shadows at the edge of the crater. They were dressed in dark armor, their faces obscured by helmets, and they carried weapons that looked far more advanced than anything Kael had ever seen. Kael's heart sank. He had heard rumors of a group of mercenaries who had been hunting the dragon, but he had never expected to encounter them here. And now, with the dragon weakened and vulnerable, they had the perfect opportunity to strike. The leader of the group stepped forward, his voice cold and menacing. "Step away from the dragon, human. It belongs to us now." Kael clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had come here to help the dragon, but now he was faced with an even greater challenge. If he wanted to save the creature, he would have to find a way to outsmart the mercenaries, and fast. Kael's mind raced as he stared at the mercenaries, their weapons trained on him and the dragon. He had no doubt that they were serious. Their leader's voice had been cold and devoid of any emotion, and the way they moved suggested they were highly trained. Kael was just a mechanic, not a fighter, and he knew he was outmatched. But he couldn't just stand by and let them take the dragon. Not after everything he had just been through. "You don't understand," Kael said, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "This dragon is injured. It needs help." The leader of the mercenaries stepped closer, his weapon still aimed at Kael. "We don't care about its injuries. Our orders are to capture it, and that's exactly what we're going to do?" Kael's eyes darted to the dragon, which was watching the exchange with a mixture of fear and anger. He could see the creature's muscles tensing, ready to spring into action, but he knew it wouldn't stand a chance against the mercenaries' weapons. "Think, Kael, think," he urged himself. There had to be a way out of this. And then it hit him. The dragon's scales were covered in those strange, glowing runes. Kael had no idea what they were, but they had to mean something. Maybe they were some kind of defense mechanism, or a way for the dragon to communicate. If he could figure out how to activate them, he might be able to turn the tide. Kael took a deep breath and stepped closer to the dragon, ignoring the mercenaries' shouts for him to stop. He reached out and placed his hand on one of the runes, his fingers brushing against the warm, pulsating surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the runes began to glow brighter, their light spreading across the dragon's body like wildfire. The creature let out a low growl, its eyes narrowing as it focused on the mercenaries. Kael stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he had just done, but he could feel the energy in the air, a palpable tension that made his skin prickle. The mercenaries seemed to sense it too. They hesitated, their weapons wavering as they exchanged uncertain glances. But their leader was undeterred. "Take them down," he shouted, raising his weapon. The mercenaries opened fire, their weapons unleashing a barrage of energy blasts. Kael ducked behind the dragon, shielding himself as best he could. But the dragon didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a deafening roar, its body glowing with an intense, otherworldly light. The energy blasts hit the dragon, but instead of harming it, they were absorbed into its scales, the runes flaring brighter with each impact. The dragon's body began to change, its form shifting and growing, until it was no longer just a dragon. It was a being of pure energy, a force of nature that seemed to defy all logic. Kael stared in awe as the dragon rose into the air, its wings spreading wide. The mercenaries froze, their weapons falling silent as they realized the futility of their attack. And then, with a single, powerful sweep of its wings, the dragon unleashed a wave of energy that sent the mercenaries flying. They crashed to the ground, their weapons shattered, their armor scorched. Kael watched in stunned silence as the dragon landed beside him, its form returning to its original state. The runes on its scales dimmed, but they still pulsed faintly, a reminder of the power that lay within. The dragon turned to Kael, its eyes filled with gratitude. But before Kael could say anything, the ground beneath them began to shake again, this time more violently than before. Kael's heart sank as he realized what was happening. The dragon's transformation had triggered something big, and it was only a matter of time before it erupted. The ground beneath Kael's feet trembled violently, sending shockwaves through the crater. The dragon let out a low growl, its eyes darting around as it tried to make sense of the chaos. Kael stumbled, barely managing to keep his balance as the ground cracked and split open, revealing a deep, glowing chasm. "What the hell did you do?" Kael shouted, though he knew the dragon couldn't answer. The runes on its scales were still pulsing, their light growing brighter with each passing second. It was as if the dragon's transformation had awakened something ancient and powerful. The mercenaries, now battered and bruised, scrambled to their feet, their faces pale with fear. Their leader barked orders, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of the earth splitting apart. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and burning metal, and the sky above them darkened as a storm began to brew. Kael's mind raced. He had to get out of here, but he couldn't just leave the dragon. Not after everything they had been through. He grabbed his wrench and turned to the creature, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to move," he shouted, though he wasn't sure if the dragon could understand him. "This whole place is coming apart." The dragon let out a low rumble, its eyes locking onto Kael's. For a moment, Kael thought it might refuse, but then the creature lowered its massive head, allowing him to climb onto its back. Kael hesitated for only a second before grabbing onto the dragon's scales and pulling himself up. The creature's body was warm and solid beneath him, its muscles coiling as it prepared to take flight. The ground beneath them gave way just as the dragon spread its wings and launched into the air. Kael clung tightly as they soared above the crumbling crater, the wind whipping past his face. Below them, the mercenaries scrambled to escape, but it was too late. The ground swallowed them whole, their screams echoing through the valley. Kael's stomach churned as he watched the destruction unfold. He had never seen anything like it. The earth itself seemed to be alive, twisting and writhing as it consumed everything in its path. The dragon's runes continued to pulse, their light growing brighter as they flew higher and higher. And then, just as Kael thought they might escape, the sky above them split open, revealing a massive, swirling vortex. The dragon let out a deafening roar, its wings beating furiously as it tried to resist the pull of the vortex. But it was no use. The force was too strong. Kael's heart pounded as they were sucked into the vortex, the world around them twisting and distorting. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the worst, but when he opened them again, he found himself in a place unlike anything he had ever seen. They were in a vast, otherworldly landscape, the sky a swirling mix of colors, and the ground covered in strange, crystalline structures. The air was thick with energy, and the dragon's runes glowed brighter than ever, as if they were feeding off the power of this place. Kael slid off the dragon's back, his legs trembling as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. The dragon let out a low growl, its eyes scanning the horizon. It was clear that they were no longer on Zorath, or anywhere in the known universe, for that matter. "Where are we?" Kael whispered, though he knew the dragon couldn't answer. But as he looked around, he realized that they weren't alone. In the distance, a figure emerged from the crystalline structures. It was tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like the dragon's scales and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. It moved with a grace that was almost hypnotic, and as it approached, Kael felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The figure stopped a few feet away, its eyes locking onto Kael's. When it spoke, its voice was soft and melodic, but there was an underlying power that sent shivers down Kael's spine. "You have awakened the guardian," the figure said, its gaze shifting to the dragon. "And now, you must face the consequences." Kael's heart sank. He had no idea what the figure was talking about, but one thing was clear: their journey was far from over. Kael stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the figure's words. The dragon, now calm but still glowing faintly, stood beside him, its massive form a stark contrast to the ethereal being before them. The air was thick with tension, and Kael could feel the weight of the figure's gaze pressing down on him. "What do you mean? Face the consequences?" Kael asked, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to awaken anything. I was just trying to help." The figure tilted its head, its expression unreadable. Intentions matter little in the face of destiny. The Guardian's power has been unleashed, and now the balance must be restored. Kael's heart raced. He had no idea what the figure was talking about, but he knew one thing for certain: he was in way over his head. He glanced at the dragon, which was watching the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The creature's runes pulsed faintly, as if responding to the figure's presence. "What do I need to do?" Kael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure extended a slender hand, pointing toward the horizon. "Beyond the crystal spires lies the heart of the void. There you will find the source of the Guardian's power. You must journey there and restore the balance, or all will be lost." Kael swallowed hard. The task sounded impossible, but he knew he had no choice. He had come this far, and he couldn't turn back now. He nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "But I'll need the dragon's help." The figure's eyes flicked to the dragon, and for a moment, Kael thought he saw a flicker of something: respect, perhaps, or even fear. Then the figure nodded. "The Guardian will accompany you," it said. "But be warned, the journey will test you in ways you cannot imagine. The heart of the void is not easily reached, and its power is not easily tamed." Kael took a deep breath and turned to the dragon. The creature's eyes met his, and for a moment, they shared a silent understanding. They were in this together, for better or worse. With a final nod to the figure, Kael climbed onto the dragon's back, his hands gripping its scales tightly. The dragon spread its wings and launched into the air, the crystalline landscape stretching out before them. As they flew, Kael's mind raced with questions. What was the heart of the void? How could he possibly restore the balance? And what would happen if he failed? But there was no time for answers. The journey ahead was long and perilous, and Kael knew that every moment counted. The dragon's wings beat steadily as they soared over the crystal spires, their light reflecting off the dragon's scales in a dazzling display. Kael couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the beauty of this strange, otherworldly place. But beneath that awe was a deep, gnawing fear. He had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same. As they approached the horizon, Kael saw a faint glow in the distance. It was the heart of the void, its light pulsating with a power that made his skin prickle. The dragon let out a low growl, its body tensing as they drew closer. Kael tightened his grip on the dragon's scales, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it head-on, with the dragon by his side. And as they descended toward the heart of the void, Kael couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. He had started this journey as a simple mechanic, but now he was something more. He was a guardian, a protector, and he would do whatever it took to restore the balance. The dragon let out a deafening roar, its runes flaring brightly as they approached the heart. Kael closed his eyes, bracing himself for what was to come. Whatever happened next, he was ready. And with that, they plunged into the light, their fates intertwined in a way that neither of them could have imagined.